Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion of Grand Cathay in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and what it needs going forward as a race, as a faction, with the release of patch 4.0, with the release of Shadows of Change. We actually have had one Legendary Lord confirmed by Creative Assembly in the form of Yon Bo. Now, Yon Bo is likely going to start over here in the Celestial Riverlands. With what kind of territory he'll start with, what direction his campaign will go towards, we have no idea. But it does seem quite likely that he is going to start here in the Celestial Riverlands. Or maybe, if they do decide to have a story-focused campaign, they might actually start him closer towards Kislev, because Kislev likely is going to start, the Legendary Lord of Kislev is likely going to start in the Kislev area. And the Tzeentch one might also start in the Kislev area as well, because Hellbrass, which is a likely Legendary Lord based on the leak we got from IMDb. People have talked about the Changeling. I think the Changeling makes more sense as a Legendary hero, because they could potentially use the Changeling's nature to give you the Changeling as a hero for all of the Legendary Lords that are going to be coming out, but we'll see with respect to that. But regardless of that, they might decide to go with Yon Bo in a separate start, or they might throw him in the Celestial Riverlands. Or a dual start, like we see with Malice Darkblade, we see with Elfarian, where you get that choice. Now, I would like the situation to be, if that's going to be the case, where you get to choose. As you begin a campaign, you get to choose. And depending on where you choose, you get the Legendary Lord spawning in that location. Because what's annoying with Elfarian, for instance, is if you want to fight a campaign in Ulthuan, you have to either disband his army and lose all those units, or make the trek with him via the sea all the way back home, which means you lose a significant amount of time. So if Creative Assembly were to do something like that, and we have no idea, by the way, but if they were to do something along those lines, it would make more sense to give us that choice. Like, as you start a campaign, or maybe a box you tick before you start a campaign, you decide where your Legendary Lord is going to start. Now, let's talk about Grand Cathay. What are the issues? Well, it should be mentioned, Grand Cathay, of all of the races, of all of the factions that came out with Warhammer 3 initially, including the Ogres, Grand Cathay is actually the best by far. But why is that? Well, two major reasons. Two very big reasons. One, they have a good economy and a scalable economy. That's really important for the success of Grand Cathay. See, their main economic building, the Yang one, just generates money. Now, it isn't an unreasonable cost, by the way, unlike Kislev. Like, their cheapest economic building can go like 500, going all the way to 1500, though in this case I believe I have a construction cost discount in this particular situation, but like 400 going forward. This is how you build an economy properly. You give a faction the ability of building economic buildings for cheap compared to what poor Kislev has to deal with. And on top of that, they do get this benefit with the Ying building, where they increase their income from trade tariffs. Now, this won't generate as much income as the Yang building, as much baseline income, but with the combination of trade tariffs, it will certainly make up for it. But there are certainly benefits for both of those. It also should be noted that at the lower tier, the Yin building does generate more. On top of that, they do have some powerful heroes in the form of alchemists in particular, because of their magical abilities with the lore of metal and crucially increased mobility. And that is something that is very powerful and very useful. Then you will look at the unit roster that Grand Cathay has compared to many other factions. Like, you want to look at Grand Cathay as to, in many ways, what the Empire could be and maybe should be, because in a lot of ways, it ends up kind of being an Imperial campaign, but far, far better. So, for Grand Cathay, at Tier 1, they get Jade Warriors, Peasant Archers, and Peasant Long Spearmen. Now, Peasant Archers, not that great, but they're decent enough as a ranged unit. Peasant long spears, worthless in a significant number of ways, but at least they are expendable. But Jade Warriors, I think, are probably the best tier 1 unit in a very substantial number of ways in the campaign, or some of the best tier 1 units. Because they do have that 80 armor, they do have those bronze shields. Like, Dwarf Warriors are better, but Dwarves don't have the economic potential that the Grand Cathayans do have. So Grand Cathay can actually maintain a lot more armies. Like, this is turn 20, to give you an idea. And I have 4 armies, no, 5 armies. Not necessarily full stacks of troops, but I have 5 freaking armies over here by turn 20. That is an amazing amount of potential between a combination of economy and the potential of units. So I've been able to win against the Skaven. I do well in auto-resolve. You do well in auto-resolve. You do well in manual battles. And you do have a fairly solid roster for what you have. Though it does feel limited. The cavalry line is pretty crap, as you might expect. Well, it's not really bad. The Jade Lancers are certainly decent. But there's certainly a great lack of versatility when we're talking about the cavalry. That said, the Jade Warriors, Jade Warrior Crossbowmen, Jade Warriors with Halberds, and Celestial Dragon Guard much later on are all really solid units. Cathay also has good artillery in the form of the Grand Cannons, which they can acquire at tier 3, so their ability to break through walls and sieges is something they can acquire relatively early on. Now, I didn't do so in this campaign, but it does give you that siege potential earlier than other races. And you also have the Fire Rain Rocket. Or you have Flying Fire Rain Rocket, Hellstorm Rocket Batteries, and the Skyjunks. Now, Skyjunks, they also have the advantage, as some people have pointed it out to me, that you can use these guys, you can manually aim them, so and be quite effective. And because they're flying, one of the problems with any kind of artillery is obviously line of sight. Well, that's not an issue that the Skyjunks have to deal with. Now, generally speaking, I do prefer the Fire Rain Rockets. They're easier to get. They're cheaper to get. They don't require you to get the tier 5 settlement, but certainly there's a great deal of power with the Skyjunks. There are some worthless units, absolutely, within the Grand Cathayan roster, like the Whooshing War Compass, because there's no point in that, because this is a mount option for the Astromancer. But when you add everything up, it's pretty solid. Cathay does need more versatility in their unit roster. What they have is good, but they could use more versatility, especially more mobility, because they don't really have a great deal of mobility on the battlefield as things stand. Like, they really heavily favored static defenses. J Lancers just are not going to cut it. They're decent enough for what they're doing, so are the great Longbow Riders, but just not great enough. Now, we have had in the story focused on Yuan Bow, 1 unit or 2 units hinted. One is a War Drum unit, how that will play. Like, I'm guessing it's going to be like something like wagon unit, or not a wagon unit, something similar to a corpse cart where you buff units around them, or a shrine that the Warriors of Chaos use, or some variant basically of the Whooshing Compass that would actually be good, because there's no point in getting the Whooshing Compass. And we do have a flying unit that, the way I read that story, is pretty much confirmed, like the Onyx Crowmen. Now, what are the Onyx Crowmen going to be? Are they going to be a hero? Are they going to be a unit? We don't know. I think also a hero unit has been hinted in that story in the form of the Celestial Dragon Guard officer. Because that's one of the points that the story makes. They introduce this character who is a Celestial Dragon Guard officer, and that could potentially represent one of the hero choices that Creative Assembly is going to introduce with that DLC and with that patch. And certainly Grand Cathay could really use that, because they do have their own issues, major issues at that. One, they lack a hero that gives them replenishment. Now, having a hero that gives you replenishment is not the only way of doing it. We've seen with the Chaos Dwarves, like the Chaos Dwarves don't have a hero that gives them replenishment. The Chaos Dwarves don't have a replenishment issue, but that's because of research. That's because of their political system that gives them replenishment. That's because you can also get it through the towers as well, replenishment for the towers. So Chaos Dwarves don't really have a replenishment issue, but they did it in a very different way than the vast majority of races have done it. which is they attached it to various faction effects as opposed to tying it to a particular hero. That can work pretty well, especially when you're building a major empire, because one of the problems with replenishment tying it to heroes is if hero capacity is limited, and Cathay can have limits on hero capacity, and if they're going to attach it to a Celestial Dragon Guard officer, for instance, that would create its own issue. So we'll see how Creative Assembly does it. The Celestial Dragon Guard officer might actually be a lore choice. Shouldn't ignore that particular option either, because right now the lore choices of Grand Cathay, like the lore magistrate is essentially considered useless on every level. Like, he can buff, but he's really not worth using. The Dragon Blooded are good, but they're casters, and not really great casters at that. So you have a caster lord that's not really going to be that great when it comes to casting magic. So another lore choice would also be very, very welcome for Grand Cathay at the moment. Those are some of the things to talk about, like greater universality, potentially a hero that gives replenishment or a lore choice. But importantly, what Grand Cathay does need is a way to improve replenishment, because one of the major problems they encounter in their campaigns, and one of the things that will slow it down for every race, for every legendary lord, is having poor replenishment. This is one of the problems Lanesh has, for instance. If you're playing as Nakari, the replenishment is really low. This is also the issue that Sinch has, though you can improve that with Sinch, apparently. But it is an issue that for every race, for every faction. Factions and races and lords that have good replenishment will just flat out do better, creating a major imbalance in the game. And this is something Cathay really needs. They do have one way of improving replenishment for the Great Compass, but I'll get into that in just a moment, because the whooshing compass sucks as a system. But in terms of their economy, great, a lot of events over here. A significant number of events. Now, another problem with Cathay is terrain. So, Cathay itself as an isolated part of the map is great. The big problem with playing any long campaign or global campaign, which is what Immortal Empires is all about, the major issue you're going to encounter as Grand Cathay is that the terrain types, the climate types that you have that are suitable are incredibly limited. So you have temperate, you have savanna, and you have desert. Essentially, what this means is that you do have the ability of selling the vast majority of Cathay, though not all of it. The jungles that are over here in the south, and the mountains that are over here in certain provinces and certain regions, including the entire province of Mount Lee, are not suitable. And I think like Grand Cathay could really use mountains at the very least as a suitable climate. This would certainly open up a significantly higher number of possibilities in their campaign, because one of the major issues that happens right now is you just end up limited. And also, yeah, jungles doesn't make sense for Grand Cathay to have jungles as part of territory, and for neither legendary lord right now, for either Xiao Ming or Miao Ying, to not be able to sell jungles. Because what this does, it basically limits your campaign potential in terms of suitable climate to Khemri and the Empire outside of Grand Cathay. So, like other races, the Empire is free real estate. In the case of Grand Cathay, though, the Empire is what you want to go for. It makes sense in Realms of Chaos, but it doesn't make sense anymore in Immortal Empire. So they really need improvement with regards to their terrain, or to climate suitability. On top of that, let's talk about the political situation in Grand Cathay. What's really annoying with Grand Cathay is, while certainly this is a much better situation than the Electricons, because you don't have to give a crap if any of these minor Cathayan factions get wiped out. In fact, I declared war on one of these, and I'm going to wipe them out myself over here in the Burning Wind Nomads, which I think are a placeholder for when they decide to add another Legendary Lord of Grand Cathay. Yes, there are 4 Legendary Lords. They can easily have 5 even of Grand Cathay, and 6 if you want to consider the Dragon Emperor, who honestly I think he should be added at one point as a Legendary Lord. And with regards to that, by the way, I think it would be much better if they added him as DLC as opposed to what they did with Mazda Mundi for the Lizardmen. We can see that so many years down the line, how poorly that went. But the problem with Cathay, the political situation is okay. The problem is the Great Bastion and some of the limitations. Like, for instance, I confederated the faction of the Great Bastion. Could I sell some of that territory to Miao Ying and have her deal with the forces of chaos as she should be? Like, I confederated them because the AI was just doing a poor job against Village. And against Zaytan, so I managed to beat the Village and Zaytan back, but they're gonna keep coming, and Miao Ying is just not doing anything because she doesn't have a direct line of territory. This is one of the limitations of the AI, so she's just sitting there letting me try dealing with all those assaults while I'm also dealing with other things in this campaign. It ends up being annoying having to deal with the Great Bastion, far less so than Realms of Chaos, to be clear on that, but still a frustration, especially because you can't trade the Great Bastion, the territory of the Great Bastion. Like, Miao Ying has direct line to the Great Bastion. It's not a question of that. It's just like, I can't do it. Weird limitations. And with the Great Bastion, yes, the Kurgan are still here. They're still frustrating to deal with. They're still an annoyance to tackle. Far less so than they were initially in Realms of Chaos, where a lot of your efforts in the Grand Cathay campaign were aimed at containing them. In fact, in the Realms of Chaos campaign, you didn't even want to play Xiao Ming, even though he had a lot of benefits, because what would happen is Miao Ying would get wiped out, the Kurgan would spill in, and you would have a far more difficult situation to tackle, on top of everything else that Xiao Ming has to deal with his campaign. Things are a lot better right now. The Great Bastion is far more formidable, as it should be, but there's still issues with respect to that. I guess I could have decided not to confederate there, but Village was about to break through more or less over through the Great Bastion. Speaking about the Great Bastion, what kind of is annoying right now is a lot of times factions won't even attack them. Like if you have the Imperial Wardens controlling, a lot of time they won't attack unless they have an overwhelming advantage. They won't even try to do so, even though they could win. So you see Village going all the way through the mountains to attack Grand Cathay from the west, which is bizarre, to say the least. But yes, the way the map is designed, Grand Cathay, in terms of diversity, in terms of the enemies you fight, that's pretty well done, but there are certainly some things that could be improved about this situation, especially the handling of the Great Bastion and the Kurgans. Honestly, could we just remove the Kurgans completely? They are really frustrating. They're just a frustration. They're not really a challenge. They're just a real giant pain to deal with. Or some way to completely remove the Kurgan threat so we don't have to deal with them constantly in a campaign. Another thing to point out over here, because Zaytan and Village are over here in the north, and because this is the Chaos Wastes, eliminating them is also a painful experience. Like, it kind of makes sense, but I would like a way to be able to do so without having to waste numerous armies and powerful armies on a trip over here, over to the north of the Great Bastion, just to eliminate some factions that don't really stand a chance at wiping me out anyway. That's just something to mention there about Grand Cathay. Okay, other things to talk about: the Caravan system. The Caravan system, it's decent, but the Chaos Dwarf Caravan system is substantially better, and certainly Grand Cathay could benefit to some extent or another of having multiple resources like the Chaos Dwarves and trading them with regard for cargo, as opposed to just buying cargo for money and selling cargo for money. I think there are improvements that could be made there. Also, I have to mention that the Chaos Dwarf Caravan system is better because you very rarely have fights, and the fights that you do have with the Caravan are like oh, 3 Gnoblars, 2 Ogre Bulls, or something like that, as you constantly do with Cathayan caravans. They're more meaningful, they feel more interesting when you do get those kind of events with the Chaos Dwarf. So that's something they can improve on from the Chaos Dwarf, just the way the events work out, the way the rewards are, the way the system works. But honestly, the Caravan system right now is not necessarily a major problem. It's just something that could be improved. It's especially like not having to fight a bunch of pointless battles. You know you're going to win with the army you have, but having to do it manually because, one, you don't want to take the losses, and two, the auto-resolve is crap, and the auto-resolve inflict significantly more casualties than you would actually receive. Like, you can win a battle with a lot of caravans against the minor ogre armies that will show up. You can win battles with ease when you fight them, but you generally have to fight them manually. That is frustrating. Or you can lower the difficulty from very hard to a low level. One thing to mention though about Grand Cathay is that if they're going to add another Legendary Lord, right now, if you're playing on Legendary very hard, Grand Cathay, and virtually all the campaigns I've played, Grand Cathay has always won. And that creates an issue because then they become a juggernaut of death and destruction that it will just spread around the world that you will have to deal with. Like invading Grand Cathay from any other portion of the map, if you don't start here, like after like 40 turns, like one Snitch, one Slow Cure are dead and village is contained and Zaytan is contained, is an absolute nightmare. Makes things more interesting for a Grimgore campaign to be sure, but for everyone else it ends up being an issue. Like, people have mentioned that on lower difficulties, Grand Cathay tends to lose. So there's some balancing that needs to happen over there. Of course, there's so many difficulties, and I think Creative Assembly generally handles balance on the normal level, which, well, why do you have Legendary in the first place, right? If you're not going to do a good job. Like, that's a whole discussion about how Creative Assembly should handle difficulty as opposed to just adding bonuses without any real good thought about it. Because we've seen for many years how poorly that has gone, and it was only because of the backlash from Warhammer 2, as well as the melee focus of a lot of factions that they introduced in Warhammer 3, that they did finally change it. To be clear, the difficulty handling of Warhammer 3 is far better than any other game they've made. Like, people saying, oh, it's too easy. I don't care that it's too easy compared to the annoying grind fest that previous games used to be. It's the pacing. It's the pacing of the campaign that ultimately matters as far as I see it. And just having minor factions and say Warhammer 2 producing 2 free stacks out of their ass was never a fun experience. My perspective. On top of that, with Grand Cathay, the yin and yang system is awful. And like this, the idea behind the system where you're trying to achieve balance, but there's also potential benefits if you're just a bit out of balance, that's okay, but in reality, you more or less always want to have full harmony, which makes sense. But what is really annoying on multiple levels with this system is not that it's in any way, shape, or form difficult to manage. It is not. It is frustrating to manage, however. And people should never confuse a challenge with frustration. Two different things. Too many people say, oh, you just want it to be easy. I'm like, no, I want it to not be an annoying bloody grind every time I play this game, because I've put a lot of hours, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, well over 1,000 to be clear, into this game. I'm not quite on the level of Legend of Total War, but I'm not willing to engage in such long, lengthy playthroughs as he is. Different discussion. Still on this subject of the harmony system, what's frustrating is you get harmony from research, you get harmony from heroes, you get harmony from lords, you get harmony from buildings. Okay, problem. It's very easy to get out of harmony, and you always want to have balanced harmony. So it's very easy to go one way or another. And this is a problem, especially for Grand Cathay, not only because it leads you down very frustrating paths when you're building your own empire, but also when you're confederating faction, it makes it far more annoying. Because, oh, you confederated a faction, congrats, their balance is completely out of whack, or their balance made sense for them, but it doesn't make sense for you, so it ends up significant balance that you have to deal with. Even more frustrating, they have events with major benefits, but it's like, oh, you get 6 yang or 6 yin, and it's like, I'm trying to juggle a bunch of balls over here in careful order, and you throw an event like that, scroll off, really. That's really frustrating. So I think like some buffer, at the very least, at the minimum, should be implemented, or some way to achieve perfect balance in the campaign. Maybe not at the start, something you have to go work for, because Cathay is actually pretty solid from the very start of their campaign, but something you could achieve, because it makes it really annoying to manage a large empire. Like, the more you grow, the more you confederate, it becomes far more frustrating than it is initially in a campaign. And maybe not have research tied to it, you know, because that leads you down unfavorable paths with research, and research has always been a low point from my perspective with these kind of games, with the Total War games, because like it just feels like an annoyance to have to deal with research, waiting all those turns just to get an effect, as opposed to being able to, you know, just purchase it for resource. Can I do that? Thank you. As opposed to wasting my time waiting dozens and dozens of turns for it, and then having the added effect as Grand Cathay to have to deal with this. Because like, you look at the research tree, right? I may not necessarily care about this benefit, but one of the things I do absolutely care about is vigor, loss reduction, growth, dragon scale, armor, fletching. Like, I care about a lot of different things, but I just get the added annoyance of having to balance everything out. Having more complexity in the game is good. That's not the problem. How you handle that complexity is it making the decision making for a player more annoying? Harmony does so, but you always want to achieve balance harmony because it gives you a major diplomatic benefit, construction cost benefit, growth benefit, income benefit, control benefit, and an army ability. Yeah, you always want full harmony. Maybe Creative Assembly was thinking on the perspective that it would be difficult to achieve, but and so they gave it a major bonus. No, the problem isn't that it's difficult to achieve. It's actually very easy to achieve it from the turn 2, depending on how you're playing campaign. The annoying thing is it's constantly something you have to manage, and it's very easy to break the balance. So a buffer, so it's harder to get out of balance, starting with a balance, having to maintain it, but being easier to maintain it, and eventually the ability of not having to deal with it would be a very welcome development. Or honestly, at this point, I would just bluntly say remove the damn system, put this as a baseline benefit for the faction, because right now you either mod it or you play the campaign in a very frustrating way to get this benefit because it's well worth the effort. That's the thing, it's very powerful, so you're obviously going to make that effort to balance it out, but it's really frustrating to manage. It changes your lore choices, hero choices, economic buildings. It limits your economic potential. Finally, with Grand Cathay, let's talk about the fucking compass. The compass is a piece of crap. Like, of all the things about Grand Cathay, harmony is annoying in a grind. The compass is just worthless. Trash. I describe it as trash, but I'd be generous. So, here's what you get with the compass. You get you get 3 bars that you can fill up, and the way you fill them up is you point the compass in a certain direction, the bars will start filling up, and this will build up the effect over here, the top effect. So either growth, defensive supplies, casualty replenishment, or control. Or you can turn it towards the Warpstone Desert, which will give you Winds of Magic, Corruption, and reduce enemy leadership. Oh, yay, that's all great. In reality, though, Celestial Lake is always the one you want to go for, but because you don't have any other way to improve casualty replenishment, you're more or less going to alternate between Celestial Lake and the Great Bastion. The Great Bastion goes up to 10% casualty replenishment. The Celestial Lake, when you have the compass pointed towards it, has a 15% economic benefit, which is gigantic, enormous. So almost always, unless you want that casualty replenishment, you want to point it towards Celestial Lake. There's never any reason to point it anywhere else, because more income means more armies, means more buildings, means you grow the empire faster and easier. Yes, there are benefits, of course, with all the others, the Dragon Emperor's Wrath, all that kind of stuff, but to be quite blunt, it's crap benefits compared to what you get with Celestial Lake. The growth alone would be worth it. When you add in 15% income, yeah, it becomes a pretty damn major benefit. But what's frustrating here is you have what the dynamic that gets created because of this is you either have to lose a lot of income while you're getting that casualty replenishment. The casualty replenishment is important when you're trying to not have to fight a bunch of grindy, pointless battles, so you can auto-resolve it. Auto-resolve matters not in the major battles. In fact, I would be fine if auto-resolve was bad against the major stacks, but the way the auto-resolve works currently in the game, it's the exact opposite. It's the worst in situations where you know you're going to win with minimal casualties, like, oh, look at Jade Mountain, it had the crap garrison. I was always going to win, but if I auto-resolve, I lose a substantial number of men. I actually lost more men over here from fighting the crap garrisons that Snitch and Lokir had in this territory, because yes, Lokir came here to take some territory from me. Then I actually lost fighting their main armies on the field. That's a problem with auto-resolve and why it should be improved and why the system as it is absolutely garbage, because it's not like auto-resolve prevents you, the way the system works prevents you from just auto-resolving a major stack on the field. You actually can. That's a problem, because do you want to risk a fight against Valkia, for instance, or do you want to just auto-resolve that? Or Snitch? If you can auto-resolve it, you probably should. But the problem is you're put in a situation where the battles you are more or less forced to fight on a high difficulty are the garrison battles. The ones you'll always win. And the worst kind of battles, especially in walled settlements. And what's worse here with the Great Compass and the way that it's tied to casualty replenishment is You can obviously turn it towards Celestial Lake all the time, but that means you'll be fighting a lot more of these battles than you otherwise would. 10% casualty replenishment it goes to is not superb, but it's certainly far better than what Cathay has by default. So you have that annoying choice, and what it creates for you as a player is you can avoid a lot of annoying, atrociously crap gameplay, or you can get a major economic benefit that will make you far stronger, but you have to go for all those pointless, lovely battles. You know what? The battles themselves are not even the worst part about doing that. It's the loading screen. 2 minutes to get in, 2 minutes to get out, and that's on a good computer. I can't imagine how many minutes other people have to waste on this shit. Like, I would love it if the auto-resolve actually worked in the exact opposite of what it does now. Like, minor insignificant armies get swept aside with no casualties, and it's the major armies where we actually have to stay and fight and strategize. Doesn't work like that, by the way. It's the exact opposite of that. That's my problem with it. So what would I do with the Great Compass? Honestly, can we just get rid of it and just bake in these effects into the faction? Like, all of them to some degree or another, get the better way of growth, casualty replenishment, and income, buff the economy to make up for it? Because the system, like, right now, it's like, oh, you get these choices. In reality, there isn't really much of a choice. The choice is, like, go Celestial Lake to improve your economy, and Great Bastion when you want the casualty replenishment. That is the quote-unquote choice. That isn't really a choice, CA. That is not a choice. That is not a meaningful choice. It's just having this crappy feature to pretend you're doing something when in reality it is really just an annoyance to deal with. Same with the harmony system. This is, by the way, the great tragedy of Warhammer 3, and that Creative Assembly had a bunch of great ideas, but they were almost all of them. The supporter system, this system, the devotion invocation system for Kislev, all that. A lot of these end up being really terrible ideas. The forced vassalization was okay, but like a lot of these systems were bad. And if you want to compare this, by the way, to a Total War Saga Troy, like the supporter system on Total War Saga Troy had its own major fucking issues, but I'll take the supporter system of Total War Saga Troy over this any fucking day. Over what we got in Warhammer 3. Any single day. In fact, by the way, there's a lot of systems that are better in Troy. For instance, the Warband upgrade system required you to have certain structures for your for you to actually be able to upgrade units, as opposed to just being able to upgrade units. Only limitation being research. Yay. Speaking about that upgrade system, it's something that Cathay could actually benefit from, because a lot of your units, what are your units? Oh, your peasants, Jade Warriors, like the mainline units. Jade Warriors, Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. And what's annoying is, like, you ultimately do want Jade Warrior Crossbowmen with shields or eventually Celestial Dragon Guard. Why don't we have a system? Why can't we have that system to some extent, that Warband upgrade system for Grand Cathay? Because it would be great. Like, you could upgrade your regular Jade Warriors into Jade Warriors with halberds. You could upgrade them with Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. Or just give us the ability of upgrading Jade Warrior Crossbowmen into Jade Warrior Crossbowmen with shields. Pointing out, because there's nothing more annoying than playing the game vanilla and, oh, okay, look at all these units, these veteran units. I don't want to throw these veteran peasants away, but like, I absolutely will for Jade Warrior Crossbowmen with shields, and eventually Dragon Guard. Like, that's the beauty of the upgrade system. There is a mod, sure, absolutely, use it. It makes your campaigns far better, undeniably so. Vastly improves the campaign experience. But I think that should be baked in to some extent or another. Maybe not as significant as it is in the mod or for Warriors of Chaos, but to some extent it should make sense. Like, switching between Jade Warriors and Jade Warriors of Halberds would make sense. Jade Warrior Crossbowmen to Jade Warrior Crossbowmen Shields, or maybe even upgrading Peasants to Jade Warriors would make sense. Should be some limits, sure, but I'm pointing this out. Like, this is something Cathay in particular, and also Kislev, could benefit from to make their campaign experiences much better. Now, that's all I had to say, but I do wish to stress out that even if CA doesn't tackle any of these issues, of all of the races, of all the factions that were introduced in Warhammer 3 at launch, Cathay is still the most playable. They have a level of frustration, but they do work. And mods do help a great deal. There's a perfect harmony mod. I'm not using it for this playthrough. for instance. But there's a perfect harmony mod, there's the warband upgrade system. There might be even a system that improves the compass. Oh, yay, for instance. Just pointing out. Not sure if there is a casualty replenishment mod for Grand Cathay. There is one for the dwarves. Maybe there is one for Cathay. I don't know. I haven't checked it out. But Cathay is certainly a very playable race by default. They just have all of these nuisances, and there are certainly some improvements that can be made. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.